We're going to invite up 5 remarkable people, all of which are authorities in this space, to go deep on this stuff, to share their personal experiences and get to the core of it, really get in it, be with it, and see what we can find. It's an honour to introduce the first guest. She has an extraordinary story just to arrive in Australia, a profound commitment to positive change, exceptional energy. She lifts us up into higher realms of our humanity. A highly regarded journalist, daring advocate, and quite possibly the smartest person in this room. A hurricane of awesome sauce. Can we have like a New Year's Eve, pretend it was New Year's Eve, kind of welcome? For Widian Fares. I was intrigued to see your seat choices, how this is going to go. So that was good. I like it. Our second fabulous guest is another passionate advocate for all things love, inclusion, community. He's spoken extensively across media on almost every program and every network in this country. Loves to get deep into issues on multiculturalism and community building. He's a part-time politician, a full-time funny man. Can we pretend it's like a hip-hop block party? Let's hear it up for Mo Alessi, everybody. Okay, yeah, interesting choice there. Our third magnificent guest is like one of those overachievers on acid. She is currently the editor of Point magazine, which is a national publication that explores countering violent extremism. So that's 4 days a week. The other day a week, she's the creative producer of a digital storytelling project that aims to strengthen community narratives in southwest Sydney. An award-winning writer, an award-winning producer and social researcher, far too modest for how fabulous she is. Can we wake up all of the racists on the other side of the world, just that they're sleeping right now, with like a stupidly loud welcome? Kavita Bedford. And our last guest, we've already met today. Second last guest, I should say. He's a man who just walks, talks, lives, breathes, creates with all heart, all the time. One of Australia's most recognised and celebrated Dig players. And I found out before, Jez, going to you were diplomatic?
Yeah.
What would say that?
I had a diplomatic passport, so it was my only way out of the country because of my criminal record, so...
There we go. He was our representative all around the world playing Dig in diplomatic places. It was pretty rad. Phenomenal story of becoming, which I'm pretty sure we're going to hear about today, but can we give another, just a gorgeous, love, heartfelt welcome to Jeremy Donovan. And to host this conversation, someone can do this far better than I ever could. She is a supervising producer at Lateline on the ABC, the former producer of SBS's Inside, a facilitator of deep, raw, heartfelt discussion, master facilitator. She's an accidental migrant and lover of dance. Can we make her stupidly welcome? Fanu Filali.
You just mentioned, stillness and peace. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey to that place?
I guess stillness and peace was something I learnt when I was locked up in Carrion, is that not dissimilar to, some of the images that we saw in Four Corners recently of the harsh treatment. I mean, those sort of treatments have been, going on for, I think, Australia was invaded 228 years ago with the idea of building a jail, and we haven't changed our mentality. We keep building more jails. I remember we were locked in our cabins and the screws came in and they soaked our mattresses with water. It was freezing cold, and then like basically we were handcuffed to the beds, you know, we had to sleep on the wet mattresses. And I remember that, you know, the cries from the kids or the young men that were in there, and it was at that point that I really reflected on a quote from Kyle Vanderkuyp, who was an Aboriginal hurdler at that point, and he was talking about when you're at the start of that race, you just have to find that complete stillness where nothing else exists. And it was, you know, probably in those moments that I, you know, sort of started to teach myself that place. So no matter what treatment, no matter what happened, no matter what the circumstance was, that you could always find peace within yourself, and you know, the external world just fell away from, you know, wherever you were.
How do you pass that on to your children?
Music and art. You know, it's probably the two things today that I find complete stillness in. You know, I've been on 243 aeroplanes this year. You know, so being still is probably not my strong point. But at the end of the day, that, you know, my kids do know that when I'm painting or when I'm playing music, when I'm singing, there is an immense amount of stillness that just, you know, sweeps over every part of me. It's how I reflect. It's how I heal.
Widianne, you and your family came to Australia as refugees.
Mm-hmm.
How did this experience shape your sense of identity, do you think?
Both my parents were born and bred in Iraq, and I think some people don't want to be defined by their refugee background. I certainly feel like I'm much, much more than just a refugee, but at the same time, what I do today is certainly shaped by where I've come from. So my dad was conscripted in the Iraqi military at the age of 17 during Saddam's regime, and married my mother at the age of 15 that same year. So for him, there was basically no choice. He had to fight in a war that wasn't his to fight. And for the first 3 years of my parents' marriage, my dad would go 25 days to fight in the Iran-Iraq war, and then come back to see my mum 3 days. And that happened for 3 years, although they did manage to have 3 kids in those 3 years, so they wasted no time. And so we made the decision in 1991. My parents made the decision to leave Iraq, to flee. It was during the 91 Intifada, where the Shia minority was being severely oppressed. So my parents fled to Saudi Arabia. My mum was about 7 months pregnant with me at the time, and we went to a refugee camp called Rafah, which housed thousands of Iraqi families, and I was born there, and we lived there for about 5 years, and in 95 came to Australia. So, I mean, I am incredibly proud of the journey that my parents made. It shaped who I am, but I recently just came back from a trip to Iraq, from Iraq for the first time, and it really shook my world. I went there always with the sense, you know, that I was very clear on who I was and where I came from. You know, I've always been proud of being an Australian and of being an Iraqi, but when I went there, I discovered that I had this identity crisis I didn't even know existed. And so for me, it was really, really more than just a culture shock. It was a big shake-up to my life. And I mean, there were days where I just was uncontrollably crying because I didn't know that that's what Iraq had become. I'd romanticized this version in my head.
I was going to say, often, you know, from a distance you sort of fantasize. Yeah.
I did. I went there expecting people to be a certain way and to act a certain way, and, you know, for everybody to welcome us with open arms. And although you can't beat Iraqi hospitality, it was an incredibly different experience because not everybody viewed you as Iraqi. People questioned me. Well, you're not Iraqi. You've lived in Australia most of your life. Doesn't matter that I speak Arabic fluently. It doesn't matter that I feel incredibly connected. To some people, I was a traitor for leaving Iraq behind. So, I mean, coming back, it's taken some time to adjust, but I mean, without a doubt, I'll always be connected to my roots, and I'm proud of where I come from. Yeah.
So Going back to the first 5 years of your life in a refugee camp, do you actually have memories of that place?
I
or-
don't remember situations, but I do remember the environment. Every time I think of the refugee camp, I almost get this taste of this grainy sand in my mouth because I remember the hotness. It was literally in the middle of the desert. I remember certain people, but most of my time, and I think I'm quite lucky that I don't remember much because most of the refugees there lived on food rations every 2 to 3 days and about $100 from the Saudi government every 3 months, which was considered a gift. And we were literally housed in a UNHCR tent. That's all we had. We had all sorts of conditions, floods, drought. We weren't allowed to work. My father wasn't allowed to work. So it was incredibly difficult to be in such an environment for such a long time, not knowing if you're ever going to get out, not knowing if you made the right decision or not.
And when you arrived, what were your first impressions? Do you actually remember the first
I remember
impressions?
when we first arrived on the first night, the migration officer who helped my family resettle, and we first moved to Auburn. So Auburn has a very I guess I've got a soft spot for Auburn. But the first night we arrived, I remember the migration officer bought some pizzas for us to eat. And my dad asked him, where's the Lebanese bread? And he goes, why would you want Lebanese bread? He goes, because I want to eat it with the pizza. So my dad was wrapping up the pizza in Lebanese bread. But I don't know why that's always stuck with me. And, but it was definitely this sense of excitement that my parents had most of all. And I remember on our first Christmas here, our neighbour gave us this massive Christmas stocking with all these different gifts inside, and I pulled out this video, and it was the cartoon Black Beauty, and at the time I didn't know a word of English. So I think after 2 weeks I'd memorised every single word in Black Beauty, and I guess that's how I learned to start to speak. You don't want to go into it, trust me, we'll be here all day, but it's one of my favourite movies because it taught me how to speak English. So I have very, very fond memories, particularly of Auburn and the people of Auburn, yeah.
Mo, how has your personal background, shaped what you do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of those, I guess, slightly older people I was 16 when sort of the 9/11 stuff happened, or 15. And for a while that actually never really bothered me, but I used to I used to have a beard, used to sort of be more identifiably religious. And so for a couple of years no one really cared. And then all of a sudden things just took a turn and started sort of facing a bit more abuse on the streets. And then at first I was like, okay, well that's happening. And then I guess I started to notice that what was driving a lot of this was there was a lot of negative political commentary out there, which was so firstly, I guess there was a two-way relationship between the people that write comments under the articles in the Herald Sun or the Daily Telegraph, and then there were also the politicians going and making statements about various groups. That was just considered news. Like, that's all you had to do to get a headline, was to say something. And I think being on the receiving end of a lot of that commentary, and also my friends, that was really alienating. Because I grew up in a family, very peaceful family, but just I think seeing this stuff in the news, and my dad's a little bit of a sort of he's a bit of a, not a conspiracy theorist, but he was like, this almost the reverse of like, we should get out of here. This country's turning, and I think I decided, I thought, look, I want to go and explore this a little bit more, and so I got involved in politics, and I started to sort of go face to face with some of the people that were making these comments, and kind of realised that they also live in their own bubble, and sometimes they're the ones that are just like, they feel like they're doing a community service by publicising these aspirations of people, but really in the end it's just a mutual exploitation. And that, for me, I think getting into politics was really interesting as well, because I got to see the other side. And then I think I realised the power of communication, that it's important. I mean, communication is really what breaks down things. Just as someone that's also received negative communication, to be able to turn that, flip it around and start pushing it out, whether it's through the media or social media or politics. And that for me is what kind of got me got me going.
So what were you doing in politics, just for our audience benefit?
Pretty broad. I mean, I've run as a candidate a few times, but essentially just. A political party is essentially just a collection of people, so it's like any social club. But it's a lot of it is really there's networking, a lot of fundraisers, things like that. But it was more about being in that environment, which was so foreign to me compared to my childhood.
Kavita, how has your personal background influenced what you do now?
I guess for me it's a little bit different. I am second generation and I was born in this country and I'm half Indian and half Australian. So in a lot of ways, I don't have those sorts of experiences firsthand. And that for a long time shaped the way I grew up. I never really questioned it. I had a lot of assumption over sort of privileges and things that I was able to do. And I guess it was only later, like sort of in my 20s, that I started to really look at ideas around sort of even generational trauma, and ideas. My grandfather, who's one of the biggest people in my life, he was a refugee from Burma when the Japanese invaded, and he went across to India, and that's where he grew up, and then brought his family over here. And they're the ones that went through a lot of the issues around settlement, and our sort of side of the family became quite the rebel side of the family. We didn't do anything according to, we kind of moved away quite a bit from the Indian community because of certain choices that my family made, like they married white people and, did all those things. And so I grew up sort of inheriting this stuff, but not really questioning it. But I think as time went on, a lot of the decisions I made around what I actually wanted to do were informed by my grandfather and by their choices. So a lot of the things that he always said was about focusing on other people's stories. He came from a sort of long line of social justice. He didn't really talk a lot about his own experiences, and he sort of put that in me. And I suppose some of the other flip side of being half is that you obviously don't belong properly to either. So I'm not part of either of those communities. And in one way that has obviously caused some things that are distressing or upsetting as you grow up with identity, but in other ways it created a lot of freedom, and it's what also spurred me to travel. And so I very much worked in Chile, in Santiago. I went to Indonesia and was always interested in showcasing and finding other people's stories and telling those in that way. And that's something I think that you inherit.